You're standing at the pump, right? It's May 2026.
Yeah, we've all been there recently.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And you're just watching those digital numbers rolling and rolling on that screen. Gas is up, what, 52% since the conflict in Iran started?
Yeah, hitting an average of $4.24 a gallon back in April. It's rough.
It is. And as you put your credit card back in your wallet, you're probably hearing this phrase echoing in your head. It's this slogan you hear constantly, on the news from politicians across the spectrum, all over social media.
Right. America is energy independent.
Yes, America is energy independent. And there's just this massive, incredibly frustrating disconnect happening for you as a consumer right now.
Oh, absolutely. Because on the surface, that phrase provides this sense of geopolitical security.
Right. But if America is truly energy independent, why are you paying so much more to fill up your car? Like, why is a conflict thousands of miles away draining your bank account here at home?
It's a great question, and it's honestly the perfect starting point for us.
Yeah, and that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are taking a massive stack of sources. So reports from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the International Trade Commission, industry trade associations, and some really fascinating geopolitical analysis from groups like Responsible Statecraft.
And we are looking strictly at the hard data here. No political spin.
Right, strictly the data. We want to unpack whether energy independent is accurate, whether it's, misleading, or whether it is fundamentally false.
And to really understand the mechanics driving those prices at your gas pump, we have to look really closely at the language being used in those government reports.
The definitions matter.
They matter immensely. The definitions of what we are actually producing and trading are, they're kind of the whole ballgame.
Okay, so let's start with the baseline logic that, we'd apply to everyday life.
Sure.
Like, if my household grows more food than we eat, we're independent. We don't need the grocery store.
Makes sense.
If we apply that simple math to a country's energy production, does that claim hold up?
Well, technically, and I mean in one very specific narrow metric, that math does hold up.
Okay.
The baseline truth in the government data is that the United States is a major producer and a net exporter of what the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, classifies as total petroleum.
Total petroleum.
Right. So looking at the 2023 data, for example, the U.S. was a net petroleum exporter of 1.64 million barrels per day.
Wow. Okay, so when political slogans claim we are independent based on that number, they're citing a real, verifiable statistic.
They are.
We are literally sending 1.64 million barrels out the door every day beyond what we take in.
We are. But here's the catch. Total petroleum is a massive basket category.
What do you mean by basket category?
Well, the EIA lumps together raw crude oil-like, straight out of the ground with refined products. So gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and even liquid biofuels.
Oh, so it's all mixed together in the data.
Exactly. It's basically a catch-all term for liquids. And to understand why a country that is a net exporter of this really broad category can still suffer from, massive global price shocks, we have to separate the raw material from the finished goods.
Okay, so if we take the finished goods out of that basket, the gasoline, the diesel, the biofuels, and we look strictly at the raw material, raw crude oil, what happens to the math?
It flips drastically.
Really?
Yeah, when you isolate just crude oil, the United States is actually a heavy net importer.
Wait, a net importer of crude?
Yeah. The EIA data for 2023 shows the U.S. exported about 4.06 million barrels per day of raw crude, but we imported 6.48 million barrels per day.
Wait, hold on. That math doesn't track for me.
I know. It sounds counterintuitive.
Because the U.S. produces a truly massive amount of raw crude. Like, the data shows that by 2025, domestic production hit a record 13.6 million barrels per day.
Yep, a global record.
So if we are pumping almost 14 million barrels of our own oil out of the ground every single day, why on earth are we bringing in over 6.5 million barrels from outside the country? Like, why don't we just route our own oil to our own refineries?
Well, it really comes down to the physical chemistry of the oil itself and the heavy machinery of U.S. refineries.
Physical chemistry.
Yeah, we are essentially dealing with a tale of two different types of oil. The industry metric for this is called API gravity.
The API gravity, okay.
Basically, it measures how heavy or dense the crude oil is. The higher the number, the lighter the oil.
Got it. Higher is lighter.
Right. So the U.S. energy landscape was totally transformed by the shale boom, right? The massive expansion of fracking in places like the Permian Basin in Texas, the Bakken Formation in North Dakota.
Right, that was huge news for years.
It unleashed an absolute ocean of oil. But 80% of the oil produced in the lower 48 states is overwhelmingly what they call light sweet crude.
Light and sweet. So a high API gravity.
Exactly. It has an API gravity of 35 and higher.
Okay, but if we have an ocean of it, why is that a problem?
Because of the refineries. According to data from trade associations like the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers, nearly 70% of U.S. refineries were built decades ago.
Long before anyone knew the shale boom was coming.
Exactly. Back in the 1980s and 90s, domestic production was actually declining, so U.S. refiners assumed they'd be relying on imported crude from places like Venezuela, the Middle East, and Canada for decades.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. So they spent billions and billions of dollars installing massive coking units and catalytic crackers. This is incredibly heavy machinery designed specifically to process heavy, sour crude.
Which has a low API gravity.
Right, an API gravity under 27.
So synthesizing this, it's like we own this sprawling, massive coffee shop, right?
Yep.
And it's outfitted exclusively with high-end, highly pressurized espresso machines.
I love this analogy, yeah.
But our domestic farms just started growing beans meant solely for standard drip coffee. We have mountains of drip coffee beans, but we physically cannot put them into our complex espresso machines without breaking the equipment.
That captures the physical reality perfectly.
So we are forced to export our drip beans to someone else and import espresso beans just to keep our shop running.
Spot on. You can't just flip a switch and reprogram a refinery to handle light crude. If you feed light, sweet shale oil into a refinery configured for heavy, sour crude, you actually underutilize the multi-billion-dollar equipment you installed to break down the heavy stuff.
Which destroys your profit margins.
Exactly. The average U.S. refinery today can handle an API of about 33, but they can almost never efficiently process anything lower than 30.
And I'm guessing changing that isn't cheap.
Oh, it requires billions of dollars in capital investment and years of heavy construction. And companies are super hesitant to do that right now, given the long-term forecasts for global oil demand.
Wow, okay, so that essentially locks us into a specific trade reality.
It does.
We are forced to export the light crude we drill, and we absolutely must buy the heavy crude we need to refine.
That's the crux of it.
And looking at the U.S. International Trade Commission reports, over 60% of the crude oil the U.S. imports is heavy crude, primarily from Canada and Mexico.
Right. Canada alone accounts for over 60% of our total crude imports. We process that heavy North American crude into diesel and gasoline, and then we export a massive chunk of those refined products to Latin America and Europe.
So we're basically a giant processing hub.
Yes. We are fundamentally structurally tied to global trade networks. We cannot simply, lock the borders and use our own oil because our machines do not match our oil.
Okay, so if we are physically locked into buying heavy crude, mostly from our neighbors right here in North America, we're clearly still exposed to trade.
Absolutely.
But that leads to a really obvious question for me about this 2026 crisis. The war is in Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. But we get only about 8% of our imports from the Persian Gulf.
Right, a very small slice.
So if we get the vast majority of our imported oil from Canada and Mexico, why does a conflict in the Middle East instantly double the price of gas at a station in Ohio or Texas?
Well, to understand that transmission mechanism, you really have to stop thinking about the global oil market as a series of individual insulated pipelines between specific countries.
Okay. How should we think about it?
Think of the global market as a single giant bathtub.
A giant bathtub.
Yeah. Around the edge of the tub are all the producers pouring water in the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Canada, Iran. And at the bottom of the tub are all the consumers sucking water out the U.S., China, Europe, Japan.
And because it is a bathtub, all the water mixes together. It doesn't matter whose spigot your specific drain is sitting under.
Precisely. If one of the biggest spigots is abruptly shut off, the overall water level in the entire bathtub drops.
Right.
And when the water level drops, the price for every single drop remaining in the tub skyrockets for everyone. It completely ignores where that drop originated.
Man, applying that to the current crisis in May 2026, the Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz removed about 10 million barrels of oil a day from that bathtub.
Which is a historic, sudden supply shock. It's massive.
How exactly does that shock reach U.S. shores if we don't buy from there?
This is where the irony comes in. The very mechanism that makes the U.S. a major energy exporter is the exact same mechanism that exposes us to the price shock.
Really? How so?
Well, when the Strait of Hormuz closed, Asian countries like China, Japan, and India who rely heavily on that specific route, suddenly lost their supply.
So they panic.
Right. They desperately need energy to keep their economies running, so they start bidding up the price of replacement oil from literally anywhere on the planet they can find it.
And because oil is a globally traded commodity, the tankers carrying U.S. oil are just going to go wherever the highest bidder is.
Exactly. Think about tankers sitting in the Gulf of Mexico holding U.S. light crude. Maybe they were scheduled to go to Europe or stay closer to home, but suddenly they were diverted.
They just turned around.
Yeah, they crossed the ocean to take that U.S. oil to Asia to chase those higher premium prices.
Wow. So the highest bidder sets our domestic price.
Always.
And the data from the EIA showed this, right? There was a massive drawdown of 6.2 million barrels from U.S. commercial crude inventories in late April alone.
Yep. That oil was physically drained from U.S. soil and shipped overseas because the global market demanded it. Global demand just sucked the domestic supplier right out from under the U.S. market.
And when domestic supply drops, domestic consumer prices go up.
Right. The global market dictates the price. And as long as the U.S. allows the free export of oil, American consumers are basically bidding against consumers in Tokyo and Beijing for the exact same barrels of oil.
Okay, so the global market dictates the price. But looking through our sources, there's some fascinating insight into the domestic economy and how that dictates the actual economic pain we feel.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting.
Because we hear political slogans claim that since the U.S. is the top producer of oil, high oil prices are actually a net positive for the country. You know, we hear politicians say, we make a lot of money when prices spike.
Right, you hear that argument a lot.
But looking strictly at the economic data, and specifically this analysis from Responsible Statecraft, that profit is highly concentrated among a few extraction companies. Meanwhile, the high prices act as a massive demand shock for the average consumer.
It acts essentially as a brutal tax on the broader U.S. economy. And Responsible Statecraft provides some really stark data to explain why the U.S. feels that tax way more acutely than our peer nations.
And it comes down to this metric called oil intensity, right, or GDP intensity.
Exactly. GDP intensity.
Meaning basically how much physical oil an economy literally has to burn to function and produce wealth.
Yes. So to produce just one single dollar of economic output, $1 of GDP, the U.S. economy burns twice as much oil as the European Union.
Twice as much.
Yeah. We burn 40% more oil per dollar of GDP than China. And this is the statistic that really puts things into perspective for me. The United States burns 20% more oil per dollar of GDP than Russia.
Wait, 20% more than Russia?
Yes.
But Russia is a literal petrostate.
I know. It's staggering. The U.S. is more oil-intensive than a country whose entire economic model is built on extracting and selling oil.
That is wild, exploring the mechanisms behind that data. I mean, it means our daily lives are fundamentally structured around burning oil just to exist.
Exactly.
We have suburban sprawl, which is dictated by historical zoning laws. We have this massive deficit in public transit and electric rail freight compared to places like Europe.
Right. You have to drive a personal vehicle to commute, to get groceries, to drop your kids at school.
And compared to nations like China, which has enacted these aggressive industrial policies to push electric vehicles and high-speed rail, the U.S. transition to EVs has lagged significantly.
Plus, our entire logistics network relies heavily on diesel trucking rather than electrified rail.
So we're just hooked on it.
We are. And when you connect this data to the bigger picture, it means the U.S. is uniquely vulnerable to that bathtub effect we talked about.
Because we can't just opt out.
Right. When the price of oil spikes, Americans cannot just stop driving or, easily switch to an alternative mode of transit. For most people, it is a rigid necessity.
So you end up spending significantly more of your paycheck at the gas pump.
Yes.
Which means you spend less at local restaurants, less on consumer goods, less on services. Plus, the cost of trucking goes up, so the food at the grocery store gets more expensive, compounding the whole issue.
It becomes a systemic drain on consumer spending. And remember, consumer spending drives 70% of the U.S. economy.
Wow.
So despite our massive domestic oil production, a global price shock actually hurts the U.S. consumer more severely than consumers in places like Europe or China, simply because our baseline economic engine requires so much more fuel just to turn over.
Man, we have covered a lot of deep systemic ground today.
We really have.
Let's recap the main takeaways for you listening. Just, cut through the noise of those slogans. We started with the central question, is America energy independent?
Right. And looking at what is structurally true, the U.S. is a major producer and a net exporter of total energy. We do send more total petroleum out into the global market than we take in.
Okay, so that part is true. But it's highly misleading to hear the phrase energy independent and assume it means we are this self-contained island.
Very misleading. Because we physically most import millions of barrels of heavy crude oil every single day from places like Canada and Mexico just to feed the highly specialized multi-billion-dollar machinery in our domestic refineries.
Right. And finally, it is entirely false to believe that because of our record-breaking production, U.S. fuel prices are insulated from global shocks.
Completely false. That giant bathtub connects every producer and consumer on Earth. If a war in the Middle East drains the tub, the free market will divert U.S. oil to the highest global bidder, and you will inevitably pay more at the pump.
So, if energy independent is too sloppy a slogan to describe reality, what is a more honest way to frame the U.S. energy situation based on the data? Like, what should politicians actually be saying?
Well, a much more accurate phrase would be energy interdependent.
Entry interdependent?
Yeah, we rely on the world to buy our light crude and sell us heavy crude. Or, if you want to be really analytically precise, you could say, the U.S. is a major producer deeply tied to a global market.
I mean, it doesn't quite roll off the tongue for a bumper sticker?
No, it definitely doesn't. But it reflects the actual economic truth of the data.
Energy interdependent. It really completely changes the lens through which you view the evening news.
It really does.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today, building on that GDP intensity data we discussed.
The Russia statistic.
Yeah. We burn twice as much oil per dollar of output as Europe, and 20% more than Russia. If the global oil market really is a single giant bathtub, and our true vulnerability is determined by how much oil we physically have to burn just to produce a single dollar of GDP, well, it raises a massive structural question.
Oh, for sure.
Does achieving true security from these price shocks mean drilling more and more oil out of the ground to pour into a global bathtub that we do not control?
Yeah.
Or does it mean redesigning our economy, our cities, and our transit so we simply need less of that water to survive?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Next time you're standing at the pump watching those numbers roll up, that is something to mull over. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.